but I will go ahead and get started with my part. So first, I would like to welcome everybody. My name is Sue. I'm a program assistant here at the Elmhurst Public Library. I am going to launch a poll right now that just asks you how many people are watching on your device. And if you wouldn't mind answering that for us, it does help with our attendance numbers. If you do have any questions, we'll ask that you put them in the Q&A or the chat. You can find both of those in the Zoom menu. And Ben, would you like to take those questions at the end?
I'm happy to take them at the end or throughout. I think okay. Throughout is fine, and if I need to wait till the end, that's fine as well.
No worries, and I can help assist you with that.
Great.
And so these, and just a reminder that we are on webinar, so we can't see or hear you. And but like I said, if you do have any questions, please type them in. And these programs are being recorded, and I will in the chat I will list the link where you can find those in a couple of days. But I would like to tell you a little bit more about our presenter. Ben Hoffman's fiction has won the Chicago Tribune's Nelson Algren Award and Zoetrope's Short Fiction Contest. He is the recipient of a Literature Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Carol Hook Smith Fellowship from the Wisconsin Institute of Creative Writing, and a Wallace Stegner Fellowship from Stanford University. And he teaches at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks to all who are here on what I know is kind of a gorgeous day outside. Right on cue, of course, the lawnmowers have started outside. So if you're having trouble at any point in time hearing me, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'm going to share my screen. And
oh, you weren't kidding.
I know. I feel like they're sort of idling literally 3 feet away to tease us right now. If you need me to get headphones, I can try to scrounge some up possibly. But in short of that, we'll do our best. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about originality in fiction. And it's something that I've thought a lot about in the last couple years in my own work, but in general, I read stories, novels, manuscripts in a variety of places. I read for various fellowships and contests as a judge. I read for journals. I read published work that's in journals. I read students' work in a variety of institutions and settings. And what I see, what I feel as a reader, like over and over and over, is not that work is bad or that work is like sloppy or shoddy or inadequate or anything like that. What I feel from the accumulation of reading all these things is a sort of sameness. Reading so much, things can come to all feel the same. Now you can say, Ben, you're just a little bit sort of like jaded and burnt out as a writer, not as a person, of course. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, right? The more you know about a particular field and the more you investigate it, the more you're sort of like things seem the same. But it's something I think about a lot, is that a lot of work is not bad. It just feels very similar to other work. Like any neurotic writer, I thought I would start briefly with a few sort of caveats and clarifications to undercut my own authority. So first, of course, there are exceptions to everything that I'm going to say, as with all art and all art rules. But I think that it's helpful to just sort of like hear someone's somewhat biased stance on something, and you can sort of disagree or not. I want to say in like the strongest possible terms, something I say to my students all the time, which is I don't think that anything that I say or that anyone says should inhibit you when you're in the initial stages of a project. What the writer Anne Lamott calls getting down a messy first draft. And that's not the time for your sort of neurotic writer self to come in and inhibit you. So you're like put all of this aside when you're in that early creation mode. And I want to say, of course, also that these are obviously not the only concerns in fiction or narrative, right? That there are a lot of reasons that people read. There are a lot of things we try to do with our writing. And we're going to focus today on originality, on like what it means for work to be different. But of course, there are other concerns in fiction. To be sort of reductive in a non-writerly binary sort of way, I think a lot of people would sort of think that there are roughly speaking, two sort of modes of artistic creation. There's sort of that unconscious genius, instinct, dream creation, just mode. And then there's sort of conscious crafting, revision, editing, like thinking, storyboarding, planning, all of these things. And I suspect, and from talking to students in the past, I feel as though most people think that originality stems from this first mode of creation. And I don't deny that a lot of what's original about art comes from those places. But I also am not sure how much I or anyone can say to you about how to foster originality that stems from this source, except to say that in general, you should be writing about the things that feel most personal to you, most obsessive or terrifying to you, the things you sort of can't get rid of by any other means. I recognize that's sort of a weird thing to say to strangers, let alone strangers that you can't see. Although it's kind of freeing because I can't see you. So yeah, you should, all of you who are faceless participants should confront your own demons and write about them. But I want to think a little bit about how we make our work better, more unique, different, more original, sort of in this second mode of like conscious thinking about how we do that. When you talk about originality, there are some problems with that. We have Terence in the 2nd century BC saying, nothing is said that has not been said before. We have Bacchylides, way BC, saying one author pilfers the best of another and calls it tradition. We have more recently, relatively recently, the great writer Willa Cather saying, there are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before. I find these quotes sort of like hilarious and depressing and inspiring all at once, right? There's something very, very funny about someone BC being like, yeah, all the stories are taken, like, what's the point? And yet, clearly there is a point. Clearly, people continue to write and people continue to read, even if there are only, as Willa says, 2 or 3 human stories and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they'd never happened before. So I bring these up just to note that like it is a challenge to be original because people have been writing forever. And I think it's worth acknowledging that problem, acknowledging that even novels or short stories that seem incredibly creative or original are, whether consciously or not, whether beknownst to the author or not, to the reader or not, working in certain existent archetypes. And when you think about how to make a story more original, then one option would be to just keep on making the plot wackier and wackier, right? And this is sort of what I mean when I say originality is a concern, but it's not the only concern, right? If you tell me that you're writing a sort of quiet domestic realism story about a husband and wife having an argument, and you say, well, Ben, like what I'm concerned about is that it's going to be too similar to all these other kind of stories that are just like that. What can I do? Well, it's true that like technically you could all of a sudden have like a talking fish like burst into the room and eat the husband who probably deserves it. And like that would certainly make your story more unique and original, but like, will it make it better? I mean, maybe, but maybe not, depending on what kind of story you're trying to write, what's important to you. That's sort of what I mean when I say, right, you could always seek to make a plot more original, to make the narrative events and actions in the story wilder, right? And people do that, right? Once there was Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and then there was this Pride and Prejudice and Zombies novel from the last 10 years or whatever, right? So that's a possibility, but I think there are some limits there when you're trying to write a certain kind of story. So I think a lot about, not about plot, big narrative events, but how to create originality and writing that seems different out of smaller components in the story. How to create complexity out of like language.
Ben,
Yes.
somebody shared, isn't it said that Shakespeare wrote every plot imaginable?
That is a great question. He probably did. I don't know the source of that, but he wrote a lot of them, and sort of like covers all of these basic archetypes, because all of his things stem from these very sort of like basic but primal human, you know, lust, love, jealousy, etc. Thanks, Leah. Yeah. So the way I feel here, and I'll sort of explain some of these as we go along, and we can ask some questions at the end if we want. But sort of like my general principles, and today we, because you're here with me, and we'll at least pretend to be in somewhat of agreement for the next half hour, we are against sameness and falseness. Something can be correct or true and still feel false. This is why cliches, which we'll talk about a little bit more, are bad. The New Yorker literary critic James Wood jokes that, you know, like the first caveman who ever said something was cold as ice was like a genius, right? But now it's like that is language that's already like taken by the culture. Fiction is made original, alive, strange, in large part by detail and language. And our writing should be weird. One of the main ways that I think about in my own work, in my students' work, about how to combat this sort of like sameness, is to think consciously about this idea, which I just sort of learned the term for this about 3 years ago, though I had sort of unknowingly been chasing it in my writing and in reading texts for much longer than that, called defamiliarization. And it stems from this Russian theorist from the early 20th century, Viktor Shklovsky, and there's a huge mouthful of this paragraph here. But at its base, what this means is that we're trying to make the familiar strange or new, right? And if you think about that example I just talked about of the sort of quiet domestic realism scene of a husband and wife having an argument, right? That is like a familiar scene in writing and in life. And unless we're going to have talking fish come into the room and eat the husband, which maybe they should, we need to seek other ways to take something that's familiar and make it in small ways like strange or new. I'm not going to read this whole paragraph, but he basically is sort of saying, after we see an object or a text or a situation several times, we begin to recognize it. The object is in front of us and we know about it, but we do not see it. Hence, we cannot say anything significant about it. Art removes objects from the automatism of perception. Like I said, it's sort of a mouthful. But up here, what we want is to make the familiar strange or new. Whether the familiar refers to a sort of archetypal plot that Shakespeare has already covered, whether it refers to a quiet domestic realism argument, whether it refers to the way that we describe a house or a smile, we're seeking to make that strange or new, even if we're writing about the same basic thing that people have been writing about forever, right? And if you have children, I have a 4-year-old. This is what it's like to accompany a child as they learn about the world, because they see things in strange or new ways that I never can. Even though, like, I'm a writer, I'm creative, I'm supposed to be good at like similes and metaphors and strange connections, but my son can like look at things in a different way than I can because he doesn't know what they mean. We took him last year on a sort of nature hike, and or maybe a year and a half ago, and times lost all meaning, of course, in the pandemic. At some point in his life, we went into nature, and you know when you're in the woods and you hear just that gorgeous sound of like the babbling brook, the creek. It's like how like imagine that sound right now, right? It's so lovely. And we said to him, like, "Hey, buddy, like, do you hear that sound? Do you know what that is?" And he said, "Yeah, I know what that is. That's the sound of my noise machine," right? Which is hilarious, right? And perhaps a little dystopian that he associates the sound of a babbling brook with the machine in his room that helps him sleep. But right, he is able to look to hear that sound, and he can sort of like conceptually view it in a strange or new way that I never could, because like I know what it is, I know what it means, and he doesn't. There's an example of this from a short story by the writer Helene Bertino called "Sometimes You Break Their Hearts, Sometimes They Break Yours." And it's about an alien on Earth. And it's a great example of defamiliarization sort of in action in a text. We as people, we know what, myself back up here, we know what crying is, like we know what roller coasters are. And so it can be difficult for us to like view them in new original ways. But Helene Bertino has sort of channeled herself in this story into an alien who doesn't know what those things mean. And they're sending reports back home. And her alien narrator faxes back home. Human beings, I fax, produce water in their eyes when they're sad, happy, or sometimes just frustrated. Water, like the narrator can't get over how ridiculous it is that like, why would water come out of their eyes? It makes no sense. Human beings, I faxed, did not think their lives were challenging enough, so they invented roller coasters. A roller coaster is a series of problems on a steel track. Upon encountering real problems, human beings compare their lives to riding a roller coaster, even though they invented roller coasters to be fun things to do on their days off. There's sort of like a sharp, pleasing humor with some deeper truth there that would be difficult for a person who just thinks of roller coasters solely as the sort of joy ride on the steel track, to be able to like step back to sort of look at it, something known, in a new or familiar way, new or unfamiliar way, excuse me. And the thing about this is that when readers encounter something unexpected in a text, in a narrative, it moves the reader from one kind of knowledge to another, from a more automated kind of knowledge to a more complex kind of knowledge. There's this example about this from the Midwestern writer Charles Baxter, who talks about on the way to divorce court, we stop at Dairy Queen. And look at my notes here. What he means by this, right, is that so there's one way to write a story about a couple going to divorce court that just entails them coming into the courtroom or the antechamber and giving each other that sort of like cold, disdainful, awkward yet familiar look And it's not, when I read something like that in a story, it's not that it's like bad or it's untrue. It's that I've seen that similar movement so many times in art that it doesn't really seem to actually be put into a story as a way of actually investigating how human beings are feeling encountering difficult moments. It's sort of like a shorthand, like a signpost, right? Like characters mad, characters annoyed, characters getting divorced. And that's fine. But he says, like, what if you have those two characters going to divorce court together and they stop at Dairy Queen on the way? And he says, like, think of all the moments that can open up for your story. One, readers are not used to seeing weird, small, pseudo joyful, bittersweet things sort of like strewn in the way on the path to divorce. They're used to sort of easier, more automated narratives. And already that's making your story more original when there's something unexpected or weird or discordant. And when they're there, there's an opportunity for so many sort of like competing complex feelings that these people might have about, yes, they're getting divorced, but they were once a couple that ate ice cream together and they still like ice cream. And there's so many like openings that opens up for the story, for visual images, for things that characters are thinking about, for like memories that are going to make your story way more complex and unique and less sort of like streamlined into like yet another unhappy couple getting a divorce. And Victor Shklovsky used the word automatism. You see here this automated kind of knowledge. I want to say that when I talk about automatism, what I mean, which is not usually a term associated with fiction or art, I don't think. What I mean is that there are ways in which you can write components of art in which readers will sort of digest that information in an automated, unconscious, non-thinking way without really grappling with it, without it slowing them down at all. And that can be valuable for art, right? That is the reason that all your writing teachers say to you, please just use said every time, not every time, but right, a lot of writing teachers will say, please just write character said this. Don't write character sneered sinisterly, character declared dismissively, et cetera, et cetera. You can do that sometimes, of course. But the reason that they want you to use said is because like it becomes automated in the reader's mind. It becomes a sort of invisible word, and the reader doesn't have to get hung up on it. And then the reader can focus on like what is important, which is the actual dialogue in quotation marks. And like that's what the reader is there for, right? So there are places where sort of automatism or an easiness like is helpful in art, right? But do you want it for those difficult moments, right? We talked about cliche before a little bit. And like the very first person who said that someone upon having a crush, they felt butterflies in their stomach. Like, yeah, that's not bad at all. I kind of like that, right? Like that sort of like nervous, fluttery feeling as if butterflies were in your stomach. Like that's sort of the first person who did it. That's sort of genius, right? It's not that that is itself bad writing. It's that cliche when things are used over and over and over. It's not that the original writing was bad. It's that it has a sort of like deadening effect. It becomes automated for a reader. And so when I read a text that says a character had butterflies in their stomach, as a reader, to me, that's like an automated signpost, like character crush. It's reduced to like the quickest, easiest shorthand possible. But like, is that really what you want when you're talking about someone falling in love for the first time? To have the reader not have to or be able to sort of like live with that character and the complexity and like the joy of those feelings and try to find like new ways to express that. Like I don't think that's like a place you want the reader to like zip past like that, right? Originality, writing that feels unique and unexpected and fresh, is achieved by traveling deeper within your own imagination and by paying closer attention to life. I recognize that that sounds like a sort of paradox there. I'm saying on the one hand, you have to travel deep into your own imagination. And on the other hand, you should write about life as it is. But the reason that paying close attention to life and writing about life and mixing that with your own imagination feels unique is because, in my opinion, a lot of art comes from other art as sources, whether we're aware of it or not. Our imaginations, our lives, the things we like see and notice in the world are good sources for our art. And other art is often not a good source, especially when we don't realize that we're using it as such. In ways large and small, the best authors seek to subvert reader expectations by playing off of existent archetypes and cultural norms. Subversion is a word that I think about a ton as a writer. How am I subverting? Like what a reader is expecting here, what the culture is expecting here, even if it's just in small ways that sort of don't let the reader like zip through a story feeling that they have seen every single thing before. And the best authors are doing that in like even just like small ways that you would never think about, right? So here's this much anthologized story from perhaps 1973 or so by the writer Joyce Carol Oates called Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? I don't know if anyone's read this story. It's sort of terrifying to be sure, but also excellent. And is dedicated to Bob Dylan, even though it's like about a serial killer. Anyway, this is just like a random nondescript paragraph, like from the first page of the story, right? Her sister June was 24 and still lived at home. She was a secretary in the high school Connie attended. This is Connie's story. This is her point of view. Connie's the younger sister, this teenage girl. She's, I think, 16 years old. So her sister June was 24 and still lived at home. She was a secretary in the high school Connie attended. And if that wasn't bad enough, with her in the same building, she was so plain and chunky and steady that Connie had to hear her praised all the time by her mother and her mother's sisters. Okay. I said just like in ways large and small, like the best authors are like thinking about how to subvert cultural norms, reader expectations. I really think that if all of us wrote this story, if we had 100 people in a room writing this paragraph, writing this story, this part here, she was so plain and chunky and steady that Connie had to hear her praised. That feels to me always the reverse of how a reader would expect this dynamic to play out, how this dynamic often does play out in life. It sort of seems, right? It seems the reverse of the sort of like old like Cinderella archetype almost. The idea that someone is praised for being plain and steady and chunky is so at odds with like the prevailing culture that I'm not saying that like everyone who reads that story like consciously stops and says like, that's so interesting. But it is on a subconscious level, at least, a way of sort of like lifting this story, tilting it like slightly askew, slightly like off its base from the kind of stories we read all the time. And it's also a way of pushing us deeper into Connie's mind, right? Like we move deeper into this sort of like teenage affect who is annoyed at her older sister, and we see like the world through her viewpoint, and it's a way of like describing Connie without describing her. So it's like doing all these things at once in this very small, interesting way. Okay. Things can feel original when they are technically wrong. Things can feel original when they are technically wrong. So two quick examples here. This is the first paragraph of this old short novel by the writer Barbara Commons called The Vet's Daughter. Not that well known. A man with small eyes and a ginger mustache came and spoke to me when I was thinking of something else. Now, perhaps that's not that strange on its own, but one thing I'll tell you is that we actually, as this is the first sentence of the novel, and as readers, we never return, we never learn like what she was thinking of here in this moment. And that's like sort of infuriating in a way that is surely like technically wrong, right? Like if a student was spending a lot of time describing like the color of a mustache and not telling me with specificity like what is going on in our point of view character's brain, I would say like, no. But like the point of fiction is to go into someone's brain and see how they view the world. Like this is wrong. You've focused on like the wrong thing. But there is something that is so like no one else on earth, I don't think, would open a novel with this line and then never tell us like what the character was thinking. It is in its own, even though like out of context, I can see why you wouldn't view the sentence as like startlingly original. There is something that is like technically wrong about that. Also, small is such like a great, strange, unexpected modifier for eyes there. I would never think to write like someone. There's something about the sentence that is like strange and peculiar, and in the context of the novel, is sort of setting the tone for what the book is about, which is about what it means to sort of be unable to know the recesses of someone's own mind, and for this girl, the point of view character, the vet's daughter, to sort of have her own private sanctuary that the cruel adults in her life like can't access. So it's this really interesting line. And then from a much better known recently source, this is from the story The Husband Stitch by Carmen Maria Machado. Some of you may have read this. And there's a line early in the story, two characters are at a party, they meet, and they go to make out in the car. And I think they're in the car. They go to make out in the car. And the narrator says of the man, he smelled like bread. And like when I was saying earlier, right, that something can be correct or true and still feel false, right? I mean, like, I don't think that I personally have ever really thought that like another person smelled like bread. So there's certainly some sense in which that's like wrong. And yet like, I like never, among like the 8 million details I have read, 8 trillion in my life in stories, like I never forget that one. Like it's sort of funny. It's so strange and unaccountable. It doesn't make, it's not like we learned some like backstory where he was like eating a sub or like his father works in a bread factory. Like it's just given to us in a way that like, it's not automated for me the way it would be if he smelled like gum, or he smelled like whiskey, or he smelled like peppermint, or he smelled like aftershave, or all of these other things that are often, I would say, like truer to life, perhaps, and certainly truer to art, but that are sort of so overdone that it becomes automated. Like this scent, like when the other details have faded away, there's something about this that is like wrong, that allows it to stick with me because it's original. And that is like a good way of sort of going back to what I was saying earlier about like letting your writing be weird, not inhibiting your ideas. I don't know if Carmen Maria Machado started in the first draft here with he smelled like, he smelled like beer and cigarettes, and then in revision she changed it to this, or if it was just like one of like those weird unconscious things that when you first think of it, part of you wants to self-censor and say, Ben, why would you write that? Like, that's so dumb. Like, people don't smell like bread. And that's exactly why, like, in your early drafts, you need to like lock that self-censor in like a little box over there, and not listen to them when they say like, don't write something weird. I've talked about some of these before, but I just want to sort of like go through these before we perhaps do an exercise or two. One of the ways to make your work original or different is to go deeper, whether that's into your own neuroses and obsessions or into like your character's brain. This is sort of it's a tangentially related topic. All the time when I'm reading manuscripts, when I'm reading student stories for workshop, compared to the well-regarded published works that I read, I think that drafts are rarely going like deep enough into their point of view characters' brains. And that has a couple of sort of negative deleterious effects, right? On the one hand, like we don't get to know the character as well. And when you think about it, like easy natural access to interiority is like one of the prime advantages that fiction has over other narrative mediums, right? Like there are, to be sure, you watch a lot of Netflix, I watch a lot of Netflix, like the visual, film and TV have a lot of advantages, but it's so much more natural for us as writers to go inside a character's head and tell us like directly what they're thinking. And it's tied to originality, because if you think about like all of like the berserk, interesting, genius, nonsensical, anarchic, perverse, taboo, weird, brilliant, stupid things like you think in your head that you would never say aloud, right? Like that is the place to be. Like fiction wants to live like in the brain where all these like interesting, like unaccountable, original things are happening. Like the things that are happening in your brain are completely different in their specificity from what's happening in other people's brains, even if the things we say aloud are much more like closely aligned, much more cliched, right? Go deeper into your characters' brains and into your own. I talked a little bit about subverting readers' expectations. One thing I think about is sort of like, is it all too easy? Do all the arrows align too neatly? Which is a way of saying like, is your story like following a sort of like long ago trodden archetype and never sort of like disrupting it? These next two things. What is thrust together that should not be? What is something that is slightly out of place or technically wrong? We talked a little bit about something that's technically wrong. This sort of gets at what I mean when I talk about writing that sort of paradoxically, writing can seem original when it takes from real life, because real life puts these like discordant things together, right? I mean, I'm not saying that every time people go to divorce court, they stop at the Dairy Queen, but when I think about just to give one example that I was talking about recently, when we had our child and my wife had had a C-section, and I was in the room with the C-section, and as the doctors were doing the C-section, they were having this very casual, laid-back conversation about whether Amy Adams should win an Oscar for her performance in Arrival. As I was like, could you please stop talking and focus? That is like, and so for me, like, I don't read a lot of manuscripts, fiction drafts in which people have those sort of like discordant, bizarre details in such a scene, because a lot of times when people are writing something like a C-section, right, they are writing sort of so that it's like thematically everything means the same thing, even though it's right, they've already decided in the narrative this C-section is going to be traumatic, or it's going to be harrowing, or it's going to be like gloriously meaningful because it's going to lead to birth. And it can be all those things. Those things can be thrust up next to each other, along with like the doctors talking about Arrival and steakhouses in Miami. They were also talking about, right? And that's not my imagination. That's just me like observing something that happened in life that was weird, because like the meaning that I was ascribing to this experience was not what the doctors were bringing to the table. But if I put that into a story, it would, I promise you, like feel like original and discordant and unique, even though it's just me like closely observing something from life rather than from other art. And you know, I think about this with doctors' offices and hospitals a lot, which are sort of like a much traveled site for all of us in our lives. And I think about the ways they're portrayed that often feel false to me and don't capture sort of like the strangeness of what those places are. And so this is sort of like an exercise I do with my students sometimes, and we don't have to do them all, but maybe if we just, I'd be so interested in y'all, without putting too much pressure on yourself to be incredibly creative. I'd be interested in you trying to do these two, the second and third one, and to put them in the Q&A. And when I do it with my students, one of the ways we do it as an exercise that really sort of like hones in on like what it means to be creative and original is you know, I'll say to my students, whenever we do an exercise like this, okay, on the count of three, I won't be so strict with y'all because it's a Saturday and it's sunny out and I'm not giving you a grade, but I'll say, okay, on the count of three, we're all gonna like type our sort of our own sentences here and we're gonna hit enter. But before you do, I want you to think about if what you put in this blank is similar to what your classmate is gonna put, you're both getting, I mean, I don't actually give them Fs, but you know what I mean? We sort of like joke about having like an originality island and we're like kicking people off the island. And I think it's like a really good exercise just because like, and when I do it with my students, I make them write whole stories, like brainstorming words and phrases that they can't use. And so I'm sort of like removing the usual modes for them and like forcing them to get creative and original. But for us here, even just this one here, well, let's just do let's just do this one. The stretcher moved down the hall like a blank. So I want you to just like think about a stretcher moving down a hall. Close your eyes and visualize it, or don't. Think about a stretcher moving down a hospital hall. And then I want you to try to put your some sort of whatever you would fill. It doesn't have to be one word. This could be a whole run-on clause here if you so wished. I'd be interested in you dropping that into the Q&A. The stretcher moved down the hall like a blank.
Then you have a response to the first one, the nurse's scrubs. Do you want to read them? Do you want me to?
I'm gonna read them as they.
Okay.
So can the other participants not see them? Just me and you?
Correct. Only you and I can see them.
Oh, great.
If they do it in the chat, then everybody will be able to see.
Gotcha. So I would encourage you to do it in the chat. I'm looking at Leah's here, which I love, which is for the nurses' scrubs, and I'll say to Leah, I have seen we've done this exercise. Many people have said what the nurses' scrubs were splattered with, choosing something similar as you, though perhaps not quite with that wording. But I love like the simile of what it looks like.
I dropped Leah's into the chat.
I saw that. Right, and like coffee, Barbara, is like such a great answer there to the nurses' scrubs, because right, like that's what I mean when I say that, like a lot of times in writing, right, people are like writing in this sort of like shorthand. So like we're in a hospital, so things are bad. So the nurses' scrubs are always splattered with like blood or vomit or amniotic fluid, when in fact it's the nurse's job, and just like all of us, she's like spilling coffee on her scrubs because it's her job, right? And so I love the way that is like, it's like removing it's like a reader will never like blood on a nurse's scrubs in a hospital is going to be sort of like automated, whereas something as like coffee, or something as perverse as like human excrement, although it looks like chocolate pudding, or the way the scrubs have paint, so interesting. The picture moved down the hall like a sewing machine. I love that. A wheelchair, that's great. Slow motion going uphill. I feel like when I do this with students, I sort of realize like my go-to was to say something like a like a Viking hearse, because I think in my head I'm trying to sort of like, without saying it explicitly, associate the stretcher with like death and sort of like the smooth voyage without saying so. I once had a student, when we did this exercise, say the stretcher moved down the hall like an alligator, and I said, like an alligator? Like, what do you mean by that? And she said, this is like a great example. Like, I had in my head a conception of how stretchers move, like a sleek sort of like Viking hearse. And because I had this, it was known this way in my mind, I was like unable to sort of like defamiliarize myself from it, step back and view it anew. And she said, well, that's how they move down the hall, especially when like a wheel is loose, and they always have a wheel loose, and they're always sort of moving like this. And as soon as like she said, like, I could then see like exactly like what she meant, how she was like viewing that stretcher, like moving down a hall, not smooth and gliding like a Viking hearse, but like wiggling unevenly. And it was like really so interesting. I think it's sort of very, very difficult to talk too much in depth about any aspect for 50 minutes, and especially one that is so like vital and vast. And so I find it helpful to just focus on like small things, right? And I'll go back to the beginning, what I said about like having a talking fish come into your domestic realism scene and eat the husband. Like, I am all in favor of like zany plots, weird plots, wild, wacky things happening. And like, I try that in my own work sometimes. I would encourage you to do that for sure. But I think if you want to write a story that's not that and feels to you sort of more like realistic, then like I urge you in like the strongest terms possible, not just in the original writing, but as you revise, to really think about like, through your own imagination and through paying close attention to life, not to like mediocre art you've already read and seen. Like, what does this thing really look like? How can I see it anew? How can I envision this scene or this incident in a different way? Like, actively, intentionally thinking about that, about, is this a cliche? How can I like disrupt this? How can I put, like weird humor right next to grief and just let those things sit next to each other? I think as a practice, as like a writerly practice, like that will make you as a writer, as a thinker, as a creative individual, so much more effective. It's like a muscle that has to be honed. And I will sort of stop there, but I'm very, very happy to take any questions if any exist.
Nothing. Oops. Oh, let's see. Looks like there was one other offering about the nurses scrubs.
I'm looking at that now from Deborah.
Yes.
It's so interesting because I think about babies a lot in the hospital, but I've never thought about like baby powder. It's so like I'm loving that it's not like a wild thing, but it's like a specific, interesting answer that I don't think the student has ever given before. And you see how sort of like the thing I'll say about this is when you can see the writerly brain at work here. Sometimes like the things you're practicing writing will then potentially like open up into like the story's like plot, or their like events, or like the story's incident.
right, does anybody have any questions? We can give it a couple of minutes. Ben, are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, I'm polishing, trying to polish for the 8 millionth time a story collection, and I'm working on a novel right now. And it's the final days of summer. We're going back to teaching in a couple weeks, so I'm kind of working on the syllabus now.
That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah, schools. When do you all go back?
We're at the University of Chicago. It's a quarter system, so we're
okay.
End of September.
Gotcha. Yes. Oh, looks like there might be one here. I find creativity very difficult and perhaps personality dependent. Writers appear to be very relaxed people. How can a type A channel their inner creativity?
That's a really interesting question. I do not think of writers as very relaxed people personally. I didn't mean to, you know, I think that to some extent, this is an answer that is, I don't mean to pass on it. Not that it's beyond my pay grade, so to speak, but like really what you're asking, I think, is like, how can a type A person open up that sort of like free flowing, like rambling creativity? And I think that the answer for a type A person like might be to sort of like schedule a specific time and space, or time and place, when you are intentionally not going to be doing all your type A things and are going to be seeking some different ways to foster your creativity. And Leah, anyone's going to know what works best for them, whether that is listening to music, whether that's going on a walk. For me, like going on a walk without my iPhone is like a way of like letting my brain sort of like ramble in weird ways, whether it's doing specific creative exercises where you say to yourself, like, I'm going to think of like 15, this is something I do with my students. I say, I'm going to think of, I make them list, like 10 things that students do on a quad, right? So, or 15. So when they're doing all of those things, they're naming like the most basic things, but also like interesting, unusual things. And then picking one or two that's like down on the list, that's less expected, and writing about that and trying, right? So like having like targeted self exercises toward your own creativity. That was a little bit of a ramble, and I haven't received that question about creativity in quite that way before. So I'm going to think about that a little bit more.
All right. Any other questions? Nothing's come through. But thank you, Ben. Oh, somebody suggested to write with your non-dominant hand.
That is super interesting. I improved my balance by brushing my teeth with my non-dominant hand. One thing I'll say is that, I mean, I write my first drafts with my dominant hand, but by hand. And for me, there's something that makes sense there, both in combating my like neurotic type A, like Microsoft Word tendencies to like keep revising the sentence I've just written to make it perfect, to go back to the next one, and just to write and like to get something down that's like messy. It's like, I mean, it's not that good, but like it shouldn't be good, and like it looks sloppy, right? Like I'm writing weird things, I'm crossing things out, I'm writing notes in the margin, and it gives me like freedom to be sort of like weird or incongruent. And then when I go to type that up, that is like the beginning of a process that's taking my like disorganization and weird things and beginning to put them together. Maybe I'll try the non-dominant hand one though. But I think writing by hand helps, if you can.
I am just putting into the chat right now the link where you will be able to find the for this program, and it's going to be at the EPL author page. And the recording should be up in just a few days, and we'll send the link to you, Ben, but for anybody who is here, they can check it out there as well in a few days. And we thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And there are some continual programs, some Q&As, and some panels that are going on, I think, a little bit longer. So check that out if you'd like. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.